All right, welcome to Big Brown GADFLY, where we give a hard time to people who need to be given a hard time, just like Socrates' horse. And that photograph of me in that intro was pre-COVID. So every time I do this show and I have to look at that logo, I am reminded of how much weight I have to lose. I don't know, Tracy, if I'm the only one who is dealing with COVID.
I can't blame it on COVID, but yes, the last year saw a significant weight gain for me, and it's something I have to get on.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Well, let's talk. Let's get right to it. The reason why I have asked Tracy to come on here for this special episode of Big Brown GADFLY is that Texas, the place where we have spent all of this time legislating, has gone absolutely mad. Things are really crazy right now. Tracy, Shannon, and I went with other people, other activists from various activist groups. We went to Austin to try to push socially conservative legislation. We had a grand, beautiful list of priorities. There were other people who had other legislative priorities. Only a tiny fraction of them even got drafted as bills. And then those bills, one by one, are all in jeopardy. The one thing that seems to have been signed into law, which looks encouraging, is the law for pro-life, correct? There was a heartbeat bill. Do you have anything that you can say about that, Tracy? And then we'll get on to all of the bills right now that are in limbo, what you can do if you want to try to save some of the bills dealing with LGBT, dealing with schools, dealing with indoctrination, dealing with a lot of other socially conservative issues. We'll give you some of the phone numbers and some of the places to call. But to start out, Tracy, can you tell us a little bit about the heartbeat bill? What does that look like?
So that is going to be signed by the governor, or maybe it was signed today, according to his Twitter. They always make it look like it's all a done deal, well before it is. But I do believe that'll get signed. It's passed both houses now. And so that looks good or sounds good to the pro-life community. But the problem with this bill is that it's really up to the technician who's operating the Doppler, because the language is if a heartbeat is detected by the practitioner. So if you go to a doctor, like my doctor, who's honest, she would legitimately try to find the heartbeat. But if you go to, like a Planned Parenthood or some, doctor that's more pro-choice minded, then they might just put that Doppler right over the liver and not hear the heartbeat. So this really doesn't move the ball down the court towards really saving babies' lives in Texas. Unfortunately, this is just another political appeasement bill. And I know that's not a popular opinion. People don't like to hear bad news, but that's just how I see it.
Well, I am glad that you brought all this up, because I have seen a lot of the GOP establishment really trying to present this heartbeat bill as proof that it was a productive session. And I agree with you. And I've seen a lot of people who are concerned about this, because what the pro-life community has been dealing with is that everyone has had all of these pro-life initiatives that they know are going to get struck down by the courts, that don't abolish abortion. They kind of chip away at the edges, and it usually doesn't put the bill forward. So there were other laws that said you had to wait 24 hours to get an abortion. Some of them say no abortions after 20 weeks. Some of them say no abortions because of genetic deformities. But all of these are only enforceable in such a vague way that there's really no penalty for doctors who just disregard it. So in this one, it's very good. Your points are very pertinent. Doctors basically can just choose to not detect a heartbeat, and there's no penalty for them to fail to do the due diligence of finding out whether there is a heartbeat in the baby. And they know, I'm pretty sure that they all know that this is going to get struck down in the courts anyway. So the real only way for the pro-life movement to move forward would be to pass an abolition bill. And was there not an abolition bill sitting in the Public Health Committee of the Texas House of Representatives with Stephanie Click?
That I don't know. If there was, it probably languished there until the midnight, Thursday midnight, where it's too late. I wasn't following pro-life closely,
Yeah,
But,
I can get you the name of the bill. Yeah, keep on talking, and I'll get you the name of the bill.
but yes, I think that the Public Health Committee, along with Calendars Committee, has been where good bills go to die this session. Same with public education. Most of the bills that we deal with that we've wanted to pass have had to go through public health or public education on the House side. There hasn't been as big of a problem on the Senate side getting things passed as there has been over on the House side. I don't know what is the hang up. We've tried to ask, and for asking questions, staffers and even some of the representatives were extremely rude. I've been called names. I've been accused of doing things I did not do, such as yelling and cussing. That did not happen. I'm not saying it didn't happen, from someone else, but it didn't happen from me. And,
but Jared Peterson did imply that you had actually raised your voice and used profanity with a staffer, and that's absolutely not true.
It's absolutely not true.
Right.
Jared Patterson from Frisco had said that I did on Twitter, and he was apparently deeply confused. But that he still called me crazy and a conspiracy theorist and other things. And I'm not the only one that was attacked in that manner. So they're not really interested in answering the questions or clearing up confusion, or, if there's anger and impatience on the part of the public. This is really simple. I, for one, am certainly ready to apologize or give someone credit if they did, really champion one of these bills and really work to pass it. But there's just no evidence to support that. And that's all we've been asking for is, can we see where you motioned for the bill? Did you motion for the bill? Just answer the question. And we couldn't get that answer, unfortunately. What did you find out about the
well, I just found it here. House Bill 3326 was the bill to abolish abortion. This is the gold standard. This is what we need. We have been talking a lot more about the LGBT issue this term, and we will get to those because there's a lot of those. But the pro-life community has been really working hard in Austin, and this has got to be crushing for them that the abolition bill, which would abolish all abortion, it was HB 3326. It went to Stephanie Click's Public Health Committee, and then it died there. Now, she brought forward, she had a hearing on this other bill, the heartbeat bill, but as Tracy just mentioned, a lot of the problems with the heartbeat bill, and we still don't know what's going to happen, whether, we may find that Greg Abbott sends it back, or that there's a poison pill in the heartbeat bill and it gets knocked out by the courts. But for the pro-life bills, what they are increasingly saying in the anti-abortion community is that we need an abolition bill. We've got to treat this as abortion is murder, and therefore this is the taking of a human life. The campaign against the abolitionists here in Texas took on the tone of saying that HB 3326 would enforce the death penalty on women who got abortions. And of course, that's a histrionic, overly dramatic reading of what an abolition bill is. An abolition bill is simply saying abortion is murder, so we have to treat it like any other homicide. Not a lot of people get the death penalty for killing, one person. I hate to say it, but you have to have a really severe kind of murder to be put to death. So at any rate, that's the status of the pro-life bills. Now, let's go to our typical wheelhouse, Tracy. Let's start with the schools. School choice failed, didn't it?
Yeah, there's no school choice.
There's no way to bring that back. Okay.
That's a real harm to families who cannot afford private school, but would like to move their kids out of the public schools where they're being indoctrinated with all this LGBTQ indoctrination and the critical race theory as well.
So with the failure of school choice, this means that was a big plank of the Republican legislative priorities. What this means is that people are not going to be able to get their kids out of programs where they are pushing these funny ideas on them. In addition to the school choice failing, there was one bill introduced which was supposed to ban critical race theory, and that turned into a gigantic train wreck, largely because I think Representative Toth, who put that bill forward, he didn't really define what critical race theory was. And so the Democrats ran circles around him until finally the bill became unmanageable. So ultimately, if your kids are in public schools in Texas, you're not going to be able to take them out if they're teaching them crazy transgender ideas, or they're encouraging them to become transgender, or they're having a drag queen story hour. You're going to be stuck in that situation where your kid is trapped in those classes and you have to go and fight with the principal. The Board of Education is probably not going to help you. The school choice failed, and all of the other initiatives that we had to try to clean up what was going on in the schools. Tracy and I had put together a list of priorities that included reforming accreditation, getting obscenity out of schools. I know that Debbie Simmons with Protect Texas Children also had a bill to try to get obscenity and pornography off of school computers. We tried to reform the whole issue of sexual harassment in schools so that people could file a sexual harassment claim if they were forced to endure a lot of irrelevant and unnecessary offensive sexual material, and it created an offensive learning environment. All of that is dead. Is that
Right.
fair to say? None of it's coming back.
I actually have a summary that tells where those bills died. Let me see about those.
Right.
Bills.
So this means that you're not going to be able to get your kids out of the school. So they're going to have a huge pipeline to recruit these students into all of these life-changing identities and these practices that we object to, that offend our moral system, and that I believe create a system that is very vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. We're just not going to be able to get our kids out of it. So it's important for social conservatives to understand that battle, that right now there's no way to do this in a nice little sideline way of trying to get the schools to just clean up accreditation generally or clean up their curriculum generally. Tracy and I also, in our list of priorities, we had a bill about research and trying to stop fake research. That nobody would even draft a bill on that. So this basically means that people can present fake material in your child's social studies class, in your child's biology class. They can present research that's not even scientifically accurate, or that has not been reliably produced through the peer review process, and there's no penalty for it. So you found a good summary there?
Yeah, I had went to see what happened to the bills that would address obscenity in the public schools. And the primary authors were Toth and Hall. And Swanson and Krause authored one good bill, which would require the suppliers of library database materials to adopt the internet safety standards and meet the standards adopted by the State Board of Education, and put internet safety filters on their products. So that did not pass. It was actually a really good bill, and forget what that went into the Culture and Recreation and Tourism Committee and died there. And then the other bills, the two Senate bills, went to Criminal Justice on the Senate side and died there. Hall had no co-authors on his bills, and Toast's bill went to criminal jurisprudence on the House side, which was Speaker Dade Phelan assigned a Democrat, Nicole Collier, as the chair of that committee. So, of course, nothing good was going to come out of that committee, nothing that benefit conservatives or safeguarded children anyway, because she supports all this gender modification and all of that. But that bill died in committee. And like I mentioned, there were not many co-authors, or there were no co-authors on these bills. And that is because, rumor has it, we really need some whistleblowers, so I don't have to keep saying rumor has it. People need to have the guts to come out and tell what really happens in our Texas legislature and why the interest of the voters is not what follows through. But there's a lot of petty, vindictive things that happen, And the word is that just like last session, there was a hit list, remember, with Burroughs and Speaker Bonin. I think the governor was behind that. Well, this is, again, the word around the Capitol that people were told to run away from Hall and Toast bills because they both spoke out against Governor Abbott's, governor fundraisers, handling of the pandemic, and and some of the mandates that came down during the pandemic. So for that, they've been targeted, and people were afraid to even work with them. Now, I did see Toth got a bill passed. There was critical race theory. He had several co-authors on that. But again, that was an ineffective bill, and I think it's just a feather in their cap to run home to constituents and say they did something. I don't think they were really trying to deceive the public. They just didn't understand what critical race theory is on that front, and they didn't advocate for the right thing. It only affects social studies. Most critical race theory is taught in English. There's mandated readings, and this isn't about studying history and all of the warts of our country, or even studying, multiculturalism, or even having Socratic debates, which should be fine, even on critical race theory. I think that we should equip our children to address these critical theories, because they're going to hear it in college for sure. An all-out ban is kind of un-American. I think it's something that, really belongs in Socratic debate, and let's have both sides of that issue. And we're lacking that right now. We're lacking, teaching that America is a great country that has overcome, a lot of its warts. So the Democrats added tons of things that are mandated to study, which some of it was so open-ended that that's where a lot of the critical race theory can be slipped in, and other things just glorifying socialists throughout history. And that's really not the direction I think that voters wanted this to go. But of course, they're going to go back to their districts and say, we passed a ban on critical race theory, but they didn't. And it's sad that we couldn't get these obscenity exemptions removed. There's an exemption in the obscenity code and Texas Penal Code that allows for education purposes, certain materials to be shown. But back when that was written, no one would ever imagine the kind of perverse stuff that's being put in front of our kids ever being put in front of kids. And that exemption needs to be removed from the code to protect our children from the really grotesque material that they're getting in public school.
Well, okay, we're going to get now to the transgender bills, which are an entire other jungle of their own. There are a few transgender bills that are still in the running. Okay, so now that we've gone over the failure in the pro-life and in the education realm and in some of these other areas, there are still a couple things that you can do on the transgender front. But I want to say one last thing about all of the education issues. With the COVID shutdown, education, K through 12 education, as well as higher education, is more of a pressing issue now than ever before. I have never seen social conservatives and Republicans so focused on education. And the fact that in the midst of all of this alarm about the teachers' unions, the kind of curriculum that is being forced on our students, the kind of sexual harassment that is rife in the schools because of this obscenity that's getting into the computer databases, because of the critical race theory and intersectionality that's being forced on them, because of the extracurricular activities that are forcing LGBT and transgender on them, the bad counselors who are offered to come into the schools, the cancel culture where they get conservative teachers fired, all of those issues, none of it resulted in any meaningful legislation. I know that many people say that it is an impossible dream to ask Greg Abbott to have a special session, but I'm going to put this up on the board. And I think that if we can just get to the point where Greg Abbott is confronted with the fact that we know what happened. Tracy, I know that you don't like to say that rumor has it, but We know that Greg Abbott got on the phone and he protected his allies in the corporate world who were going to threaten to pull out of Texas or threatened to shut down some of their branches, or they said that there was going to be some consequences. He protected the teachers unions, the textbook companies, these big expensive Christian colleges, which are bogus Christian in quotes, and the private colleges and the state universities. He protected all of them at the expense of educating our children, which is such a huge issue right now. Tracy is a proud homeschooling mom, and I respect her so much for that, but a lot of us can't do that. We can't homeschool. And our kids, it does not matter if you pull your kids out of a public school and put them in a Christian school or a private school. This stuff, because of the accreditation process, which did not get reformed at all, they're going to be subject to a lot of the same standards. And then when they graduate and they go to college, forget about it. They're going to be, doesn't it not matter if you go to a Southern Baptist seminary? I learned that the hard way. You're not going to get a quality education. And the only way that we can address this is if Greg Abbott has a special session where we talk about education and pro-family issues, and there is not this artificial time pressure, because the time pressure is fake. We know that it's not that they ran out. It's not that they couldn't overcome this constitutional hurdle in Texas or not. They rigged this session. They killed all these bills. And the good news is that more Texans see this than ever before. And this affects everybody who has kids in Texas. Everybody. So if you can contact the website and at the phone number that we put on the screen, if we can get a special session, then maybe we can open it up for meetings with some of these representatives and find someone who can draft legislation, who can deal with this, because the voices are out there. People are tired of it. And I agree with what Tracy said. The bill to ban critical race theory was it was a flop, but it was designed to be a flop. And ultimately, the problem is not that people are teaching Frederick Douglass in our classrooms, okay? We want them to learn about all the great literature from around the world. We want them to learn foreign languages. We want them to learn the history of sensitive topics like slavery and Jim Crow and the Holocaust, etc. But we don't want the intersectionality and the leftist Marxist spin to be superimposed on it. And in order to tackle some of these things, we're going to need to have more time, and we're going to have more attention put to this. Okay, so having got on my soapbox, I'm going to put this up a couple more times about the special session. Now let's talk about the big elephant in the room. What is going on with the transgender issue? You have our attention, Tracy, Shannon. Tell us what's going on.
So most of the bills died in Representative Stephanie Click's Public Health Committee. And most of them never even got a hearing. And that was because of Representative Click. We can only assume unless she feels like telling us differently. But they never got out of her committee. She had a hearing for House Bill 1399, and it languished in her committee for a month before it went to calendars, where it languished for 2 weeks before getting scheduled on the general calendar, which isn't the main calendar. So it had over 300 bills ahead of it. So come last Thursday night at midnight, anything that had not been heard on the House side was dead. So most of these bills do not have a chance. There's still this very tiny sliver of a chance that Senate Bill 1311, which had, let me look here because I forget, it had companion bills on the House side. House Bill 1399 is a similar bill to Senate Bill 1399, and House Bill 2693, which never got a hearing in her committee, is the identical bill. So that's a companion bill, and it's always better to have one in the House and one in the Senate already passed. And this could have been accomplished if it would have got out of Click's Public Health Committee. And then the other obstacle is getting out of Dustin Burrow. He's a representative from Lubbock, getting out of his committee because they were not very, they weren't very eager to get this bill out. Now, these bills, this is a Republican Party of Texas priority bill, but unfortunately, Republican Party of Texas priorities don't seem to match the priorities of those who are elected to represent Republicans in Texas. And that's something that's going to have to be changed at some point. We can talk about that later. But most of these bills are gone. What you can do now is call Representative Click, ask her to advocate for Senate Bill 1311 to quickly pass out of the Senate into her committee, and for her to move it quickly out of her committee, and then we'll have to lean on Dustin Burrows and ask him to move it quickly. Now, what could happen if Dan Patrick wanted to use his power is he could tell the House, once the Senate passes 1311 out, he could tell the House, we will refuse to hear another House bill until Senate Bill 1311 is voted on in the House. He could certainly do that. So he has the power to do that, and people should call him and tell him that that's what he needs to do. This is a priority of protecting children. This isn't an anti-trans issue that it's been tried, made out to be. This isn't about throwing parents in jail, because these parents are being duped by the transgender ideology. They're being sucked in like by a cult. But we do need to stop this process and hold these gender clinics responsible and accountable for what they're doing to children. And I do think, to be honest, I think this is child abuse, and these parents, some of them are abusing their children, and they're not as naive.
I do know as well that there are some sports bills that are still in the playing, but I do want to get people's attention to the bills that Tracy just talked about. The whole idea of banning biological boys from playing in women's sports, I think it's important. It is a useful thing to focus on so you can learn about some of the impacts of the transgender movement, but it's not the main issue. What we're striking at here is the main issue, which is the harm that's done to people who are too young to make a decision of this magnitude, and the kinds of procedures that are being performed on these young people. It's not well researched. That's why we really wanted there to be bills to clean up the research regulations. That didn't go through. So now all of these procedures, as we've seen with a lot of detransitioners who have been publishing their experiences online, they're saying these procedures are not even governed by a systematic set of rules. There's no criteria to say whether the transition that was carried out was done in a medically sound way. We don't know. And you can't sue for people who completely botched it up, or counselors who told you that you were trans when they were wrong. They did not assess you well, or you were pressured into it, or somebody was malfeasant and they just did it for money. You can't try to go and recoup the harm that was done to you. So the bills that Tracy just talked about are the most important. It's not to downplay the issue of the sports, but I think if we can get a bill through that can stop the gender transitioning in minors, that would be key. And that does fall again on Representative Stephanie Click. Her number is up there on the board because she's holding up right now this bill. Now, I have seen several statements that were put online by people who are tied to Click's office or her supporters that are saying that actually she's been working really hard to get this last bill through. So I'm not going to second guess her, but show us the money, right? Is that a fair way to talk about this, Tracy? If that's the case, then let's see you get this bill, right? Let's do the crap thing like the liberals like to do. Pass this bill, all right?
Pass the bill. Right. We'll give her credit when it gets before the governor. Unfortunately, she had similar bills or identical bills she could have passed out. Now at the last hour, she's saying, or, people are saying on her behalf that she's advocating to move Senate Bill 1311 through. If in fact it does move through, we will give her credit for that, but we shouldn't have had to be knocking on doors and doing, breathing down people's necks and babysitting our representatives on this issue. And she should have had hearings on both, on at least two bills that had similar bills on the Senate side. That would have, if you're really serious about wanting to get something passed, that's what you do. And she didn't do that. So that's really unfortunate. And it really comes down to her. 4 out of 6 bills died in her committee. One bill was extremely slow walked by her committee. So, if she has another story as to why that, what happened, we're eager to hear it. The voters would like to know, but we're really not in the mood for accepting excuses for not protecting children.
Yeah, and there was really no reason to wait this long when she was the chair of the committee. These bills were filed last year in 2020, and she had them, and there were a lot of people on the phone to her office asking her to move on them, and she just sat on them all the way until the end. And so do not accept the excuse that there was not enough time. That is not an acceptable excuse. The other thing, this has been emphasized a lot by Dr. Stephen Hotze, the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, he can push things through because if he says so, the Senate can be told that they can't vote on any of the other priorities until they get through the legislation that we're talking about. The Governor Patrick, from what I understand, he has a lot of procedural power over the Senate. And so that is a very powerful bully pulpit, and he has the levers. So he can force these bills to get to the final stage where they go to Governor Abbott's desk, right? Isn't that fair to say? So I think if you might want to call the Governor Patrick as well and tell him to make this happen. We are talking now about all we are asking for is for them to pass a bill that says that people who perform mastectomies on 14-year-old girls, removing their breasts, removing the testicles of underage boys through chemical castration or through actual surgical mutilation, people who are giving untested, really unsound puberty blocking drugs to young people, which will render them infertile, which will retard their growth so that they're not going to be able to develop fully. That's all we're asking for. And we can't even get that. And I don't even think that we should settle for that. If that bill had passed, Tracy, I would still be on here saying, this is not the most conservative session in Texas history. There's a lot of stuff that we have to be done. We still, I believe, need a special session.
Right.
If people are angry, and if this can get on the Tucker Carlson show enough, Greg Abbott is sensitive enough to his public reputation that maybe people calling in and saying we need a special session, maybe that will work. But we need time for people like Tracy to get to Austin and to educate people about all the angles of this, because we need to tackle the cancel culture. We need to tackle the bad research. We need to tackle the pressure that's on in the schools. We've got to be able to talk about the unconstitutional mandates that are coming forth. So we have to have a nullification discussion. There's a lot to talk about, the accreditation of the schools, and we're not talking about any of it, right? And so at this point, yes, we want to get this bill through with the lieutenant governor. If we can get that victory, that's good enough. So that's your first order of business if you want to get involved. But the second order of business is if you can put a pressure on the governor to give us a special session. And as you're doing that, it's good too, because eventually we're going to have to pressure Greg Abbott to sign any ban on pediatric gender transitioning, because he doesn't want to sign that. Isn't that true, Tracy? Because these corporations are not happy with him.
It would affect his fundraising, and he's a very effective fundraiser. So, he doesn't want to go against the corporate interests that are really lying. They're saying we're not going to be able to attract skilled workers to Texas, in the technology sector, if we pass this bill banning gender modification, mutilation of children. That's a bold-faced lie. I mean, are all tech people eager to mutilate their children? I mean, what are they trying to say?
Texas is not seen as a pro-LGBT state, and the companies are already flooding into Texas. So it's not like these companies are going to shut down their plants in Houston and then move back to San Francisco and pay all of that money in taxes and have to have their employees pay $3 million for a tiny little house. They're not going to do that. It's a bold-faced lie. And even if we didn't have this influx of people, Tracy, tell me how your home assessment is doing, because we're worried here. And where I am living, our home has gone up by 70% in just about 6 months. So that means, and in Texas, they kill us on the property taxes. They don't kill us on the income tax. We don't have an income tax. But right. So why do we want to maintain this constant flood of population into Texas? We honestly don't need it. Isn't that fair to say?
Right. I mean, my home evaluation went up 50% in the short time that I've lived here. So, and I think I've lived here 3 years. So it's really a strain on people that they're paying all these property taxes, and then how are they really using our taxes? It's not being put to the use that we're being told. I mean, we didn't maintain the electric grid for one thing, and that's fundamental. So yeah, and we're not improving education. We've only been making it worse in Texas, and they're always talking about pouring more money into that, and there's not enough money. It's like no matter how much you pour into it, it doesn't seem to get better because we're dumbing down education and indoctrinating the children. We need to have a special session because we haven't really passed anything to safeguard children, which is my passion. And the indoctrination remains in the schools. The sexual grooming remains in the schools. And that has to be addressed. If we're going to have children coming home, you know, even if they ban the gender modification, which it so far doesn't look very promising, you still have your kids coming home with the schools using other pronouns for them and a new name, and your kids coming home being alienated from you because they've adopted this gender ideology that they're taught in school. And now the parent is pitted against all these institutions, counselors, CPS, medical complex, and the schools that are all following affirmation only. Well, and you're trying to rescue your kid from going down this path and getting on the conveyor belt of mutilating their bodies at some point. So, you know, this is something that they are aggressively alienating children from their parents in the public schools with this gender ideology and also with critical race theory. And those two things really haven't been addressed, even if they say they address critical race theory. So yes, a special session is needed for safeguarding, but, you know, at a minimum for safeguarding.
Yeah. And ultimately, if none of this happens, if all we get is the pediatric gender transitioning bill, the ban, if we get that, they're going to come back and they're going to say, look, we had the most conservative session ever. Yeah. I will applaud that bill being signed, but guys, it is not. A bill has some holes in it as well. Okay. And this is what Tracy has pointed out. Even if we get this dream bill to ban gender transitioning in minors, it's only dealing with the medical, surgical, and pharmaceutical side of it. It is not dealing with any of the social transitioning. It is not touching any of the indoctrination, the bad research, the social pressure, the harassment, the cancel culture, none of that. And on top of it, all it is really doing is saying that you can't have insurance cover your liability if you engage in these procedures. That's the only way that it would be enforced. But ultimately, Texas is ruled by tort reform. Tort reform is basically this idea that we want to make it really hard for people to file lawsuits because the Republican Party went through this period where they said the worst thing in the world is everybody suing everybody. And so they thought a great way to get back at all the mean lawyers in the world is to make it so that you can't file lawsuits. That's wonderful. But now there are tons of people I know who have legitimate claims and they can't file a lawsuit because it costs so much to get a lawyer and the rewards are so capped, and to get through all of the hurdles to actually be able to go before a jury and bring your case. And then you sue somebody and they are able to depose everyone and do discovery on all these things in your life. So people can't sue. So even if this bill passes, Tracy, right, people are not going to be able to, what's going to be the penalty ultimately for you as a physician for castrating an underage boy or cutting off the breast of an underage girl or any of these things? What's going to be the penalty?
Well, there's, you won't have your liability insurance. I mean, you can operate without liability insurance in Texas. Okay. So they can continue their practice because it's a very lucrative business, mutilating children. Okay. It's very lucrative business prescribing puberty blockers to children. In fact, I think they make like 8 times more money on a prescription for puberty blockers for children for the drug Lupron than they do prescribing it for an adult for some reason. So this is a very lucrative business. That's why it's grown so much in such a short time. We've gone from 6 gender clinics and 7 in the United States, and to now, and just in a short time frame, like 7 years. 7 years later, we have 300 pediatric gender clinics. And when I said we used to have 6 pediatric, now we have 300 pediatric clinics with at least 17 in Texas, and that doesn't even include Planned Parenthood that prescribes hormones. And the WPATH standards say 18 and above, but really that's relaxed a lot. And like on the Planned Parenthood website, they even say, they use the word may, these are some of the considerations that may apply. So you may get your hormones at Planned Parenthood as well. And that's what we've heard from nurses, that there are teenage girls going in and getting testosterone at Planned Parenthood, and they go in groups. So this is a peer thing. They're learning from their peers. It's a new golf, only you just can't wash it off, and you can't go back to having the voice you once had, and you can't go back to growing your, if you lose hair through male pattern hair loss, that's irreversible, and when you grow a beard, it's irreversible.
So let's say that we get the pediatric gender transitioning bill through, and this would depend on everyone out there calling up Stephanie Click, right? Calling up the lieutenant governor, calling up the governor to make sure he signs the bill. Even if we get that put in place, what happens the next day? The next day, we still have clinics that are currently performing surgery on minors. That is something that Tracy Shannon and her supporters documented. Is that true or false? Gender surgery is being performed on minors in Texas.
It absolutely is. And there's just a girl had posted on her TikTok that she was from Texas and that she was 13 years old. I don't know how credible this young girl's TikTok is, but she said she had double mastectomy in Texas. So we knew they were doing it as young as 14 from our phone calls to clinics in Texas, but perhaps they're even doing it younger. I know that some clinics in other states are doing it younger, and they're advocating. I mean, the gender industry is advocating to do these surgeries younger and younger because they truly believe that a child as young as 8 or 12, or they say 7, 8 years old, they really know who they are. That's what they claim.
Right. So this is happening. So the day after we get this ban passed, do you think that all these clinics and all these doctors and these kooky, quacky counselors are just going to close up shop and say, okay, I'm going to leave minors in Texas alone? No, that's not going to happen. Sorry to tell you. What's going to happen is they're going to continue to do all of this. They're going to rely on student confidentiality so we can't find out about it. They're going to rely on confidential orders or gag orders being issued by family courts, as we saw. Those were abused in the Save James case, where the ex-wife is forcing the young child to transition, and therefore they're using the confidentiality clause so we can't get the court records, we can't find out what's happening because family court blocks it, or they're going to use the HIPAA laws about medical privacy. So they're going to continue to do this. We won't have any way of finding out whether they're doing it, and the only way that they will face any consequences is if somebody sues them or files a complaint, which would force them to lose their liability insurance. The person who comes forward would have to sue to really inflict any damage on the person who did this malpractice, and then they're in the world of Texas tort reform. Good luck. You're probably not going to be able to get a lawsuit through. If you were going to do a lawsuit, practice. So there's really no long-lasting damage to their medical career. And on top of all that, even if we pass this law, we're still going to have to face the fact that it will go into the courts almost immediately. And all of the same GOP players who were so lukewarm about supporting this during this session are then going to be lukewarm about supporting or giving amicus briefs on the side of the petitioners if this goes to court. So you're going to have a situation where then we're going to have to ask Gregory Abbott, are you going to have your attorney general file a brief in support of this law? And then don't be surprised if the attorney general says, yes, we'll look into it. And then they'll quietly withdraw their support for the case, which is what they usually do. So even if we get this bill, which I want to get, we have to understand it's not the end of the road. Is that fair, Tracy? It's not the end of the road.
Right. This is still, I do want this bill to pass because it's, similar to the abortion abolition. It's always a step in the right direction. It's a statement of right and wrong. And really what's needed ultimately is a much stronger bill with some teeth to it that the attorney general would then enforce and be able to shut these clinics down. And you also should be banning insurance coverage of these procedures, because Blue Cross Blue Shield and many others, Aetna, cover these procedures. They even cover like really strange procedures like nullo procedures and non-binary procedures. They take the breasts off girls and leave them with no nipples and do strange things to the genitalia down below, like sew vagina shut and smooth out where a man would have had male anatomy. So this is by removing it and then smoothing it out. That's a fetish, and that's something that is known about like in the prostitution world. But these are actual surgeries that they are calling affirmative surgeries, and no doubt that these people will be advocating that this is life-saving care. This is really all really disgusting mad science that they're doing. And it should be outlawed completely. We needed stronger language than we got in these bills, and our Republicans still didn't have the moral courage to even pass this. And that's what
even this little side part of it. And we can see the poison pills, the wiggle room, everything. We can see the weasel words in it. But hey, we'll take this if you can even get this through. But I still think that there's two things I want to bring up to people who are out there. Is this the most conservative session ever? Tell the GOP your thoughts. That's the number for the Texas GOP. We need to line them up and primary them all one by one, because we need a whole new game in town. All right. Remember that the lieutenant governor can push things through, and he'll be an important person to contact. And remember that we also need to demand a special session because we've got to move on a lot of these other things. One last thing that I wanted to mention that Tracy and I were lobbying for in Austin that did not get picked up anywhere was protection of a child's right to their mother and father. This deals with immigration, divorce, birth certificates, all of these things. There are so many ways in which in Texas you can sever a child's link unwillingly, unwillingly on the part of the parent or on the child. You can sever their link to their mother and father. And what ends up happening is you have cases like the Save James case, where there's an ex-wife who's forcing this transgender stuff on the child. The father has no say in it. You have children who are then now part of a sex trafficking market that is bleeding into the black market for adoption, right? Because in order to placate the gay lobby, they said, no, not every single person needs to have a mother and father on their birth certificate. So then you have a game with, well, who is on the birth certificate? Who are these people? Did they buy this baby? What happened to the original biological person who conceived this child? Are they all sperm banking babies? Are they all surrogacy contracts? Well, then how do we feel about sperm banking and surrogacy contracts on a massive statewide level? Isn't it relevant for children to know that they might have 55 genetic brothers and sisters in the same neighborhood because the same sperm donor was used. There's all of these things, and it affects immigration. Okay, I know immigration is a very emotional topic for a lot of people, but let me tell you right now, if we really pursued family unification in terms of making sure that every child intercepted at the border has their biological mother and father's consent and understanding to be there, a lot of this traffic would get shut down. And 9 times out of 10, the reunification process would involve tracking down the parents in their country of origin and sending them to be raised properly in the country where they were born and where they are from that culture. So protecting a child's right to a mother and father is so important. And that did that even come up as a blip on the radar? I mean, nobody is interested in that. And so our birth certificates are a mess. Family court's a mess. The school activities, the permission slips, everything is a mess because we're denying the basic reality that every child is the product of a mother and father, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, our public records are a mess right now because of gender ideology and the LGBTQ, persistent pressure to make medical records, legal records, birth records all reflect things that aren't true. The parents of a child are the mother and the father. That's the reality. A parent has always been those people who conceived them. Now, obviously, there are other circumstances like adoption, but we have just completely rolled over to allowing lies on all documents, like changing names and changing sex on documents. And documents should reflect reality, even in the case of an adoption. In the case of adoption in many states, you can put that you're the biological parents of the child that you adopted. And, I know that those people are no less parents because they're raising these kids that they adopted. I have plenty of friends who have adopted kids. But the reality is, there are other parents, and it should reflect that reality because, they may need to track them down and make sure that these kids weren't bought.
Right. If you hang around the adoption community, these are things that these are emotional debates that they have had. We should build on the wisdom that they earned through decades of making mistakes, figuring out what works and what doesn't. And the voices of these adoptees who came forward and talked about what is really ethical. They had the discussion about what's ethical to put on a child's birth certificate. This was way before the LGBT issue ever came up. But then the LGBTs came in and they said, okay, none of that previous debate exists. We just want a piece of paper that says, me and my husband are the two fathers of this child and there's no mother, right? And they just swept aside centuries of debate about adoption and inheritance and legacy and responsibility and these familial bonds. I mean, when you read the narratives of adoptees who went back to try to find their biological parents, this is a very, very complex issue, and it's deep. And I think you're right that there are a lot of adoptive parents who, prior to the LGBT movement, they had to go through tremendous hurdles in order to be able to adopt a child. They couldn't just fly to a foreign country and show up at an airport with a baby. If they're two white people, they can't just show up with a black baby and be like, oh, hey. I mean, they have to be able to have paperwork that legitimately explains the adoption process and how they came into custody of this child. But we've streamlined and falsified so much of that documentation process. It is no wonder that the border is going to be completely unresolvable. It's going to be completely irresolvable when you have 35,000 unaccompanied minors and they're there with all manners of adults who are not related to them, who can't explain where the child came from. And this is the fruit of this kind of social experimentation policy. This is the kind of unintended consequence that you can't see miles down the road because you're so worried about your neighbor who has a child that is struggling with gender identity. And you think that, well, we're just going to accept all these changes and not look into any kind of meaningful regulation,
Right. I mean, my own children and myself, we've had to document, who their father is. I mean, He has a different name now. It doesn't match any of the children's documents. So when we're trying to do permission slips, signing up for anything, there's this big
Wow.
issue where there's this person named as the parent, but none of our documents, the kids' birth certificates, have their dad's real name, his birth name. Now, if he goes and changes, I don't know if he has, he could have changed his own birth certificate by now, because that's allowed. You're allowed to change your birth certificate now. Maybe he's done that. So the person that actually created these children with me could just not exist on paper anymore. And that's not right. And it just makes it really so much harder when they do things like try to, apply for the military and prove what their heritage is. And it's very hard to do. So people they have not thought through the consequences of all this. They just think they're thinking about people's feelings, just like you're not thinking about or even aware of some of the things that go on with these children who are transitioning. They don't know about the Packers, that some of these parents think it's okay to put a fake tiny penis in these girls' underwear. For girls as young as 3 years old. Most people don't know about that. They're just seeing the cute little child presented as a boy, or the cute little boy presented as a girl, and we all like, oh, nobody wants to hurt their feelings, right? They're saying this is who they are, and no one wants to hurt their feelings. However, the reality is that they're on the conveyor belt to some serious damage to their bodies, and also emotional and psychological damage.
Well, and you brought up something I remember about Click that I think is worth reminding people. The account that came from Jeff Younger was that Stephanie Click said she didn't want to have hearings on these bills because it would traumatize trans people. And I don't know whether she said that or not, but there's a number where you can call her to give her your perspective on it. Oh, wait, talking about
little children.
One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind with all of this is I've lost my train of thought. It is that when you talk about trauma, I think a real problem with the discussion that we have these days is that some people's trauma seems to count and other people's trauma doesn't seem to count, right?
Right.
So, for instance, they're worried about the state of the laws. If we have a discussion about changing it, some person who's struggling with their gender identity is going to feel suicidal by listening to the debate. But then you look at a trans widow, for instance, a woman who, if she were left by her husband and she was stuck with 3 kids, she could get that guy thrown in jail for not paying child support, right? But I bet you anything that if someone gets their name changed on a birth certificate and comes out as trans and then vanishes, it's going to be a lot harder to get the support for their children. So the traumas that you could not inflict without serious repercussions before, under this new set of laws, you can inflict traumas on people and not pay any kind of price for it, which then, of course, incentivizes people to go and engage in those kinds of activities. There's tons of people who are traumatized by the direction that things are going. Somewhat like an ex-husband who sees his ex-wife forcing the child into this. The child growing up and seeing that an older sibling has all of a sudden changed from one gender to another, and then going through all of that and having to live through all of the divisions in the family as people react to it in different ways. Do you have any closing thoughts before I run off and try to engage in my own form of parenting here with my son? Do you have any other thoughts?
There are all kinds of victims to this ideology that people haven't thought of. Women are victims to this ideology in women's shelters and women's prisons, in all women's spaces. We are being victimized by this ideology. Parents, you're being victimized by this ideology. It's alienating kids from their parents when they come home and they say they are someone who they are not. This is affecting the medical field, where medical records now have lies. This is completely unsafe, and we're losing confidence in our medical profession in the United States. And some women do not even want to continue to get their care because of the affirmation of this ideology. When you go to register for a procedure, they ask you what sex were you identify, or what gender were you assigned at birth, and do you still identify with that? Well, how does that make me feel confident about the care I'm going to receive, and what kind of doctors are at this facility when they are engaged in the acceptance of such an unscientific and dishonest ideology? I mean, there's just not one area of life, your free speech, the family courts, your parental rights, it's coming for all of it. It's here. This isn't a warning. It's already here. If it hasn't touched your life, it will touch your life, or maybe you're just not paying attention. We all need to be standing up to this. We need to be making the phone calls, the numbers that Bobby's been putting up on the screen. Please make those calls, make them tomorrow. The possibility is that Senate Bill 1311 will be heard in the Senate tomorrow, and then it'll move forward over to Public Health, Clicks Committee on the House side. And if she moves that out quickly, then it'll be in calendars, where we would really need to apply pressure to Dustin Burrows and everyone on the calendars committee to move that forward. So please be making the calls, because this does affect every aspect of our lives.
Thank you very much, and we will be broadcasting again soon. Thank you.